Thank you so much. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Thanks, first of all, for this wonderful opportunity to contribute to what I hope will be a kind of galvanic event. We've had some very useful perspectives already. What I want to do is to, as a historian, look at the slightly dusty, but in my eyes, interesting past, the distant history of Islamophobia, what Islam has made of it, what the Quran makes of it, and what Europe has historically made of it, and what Muslims have made of it. So one place to start, I think, would be to observe that Islamophobia is, I think, to an increasing extent, a manifestation of a more wide prejudice in Europe against religion, all religion. I recently celebrated a marriage in Putney, and afterwards I came out and I like to dress up, so I had my Ottoman outfit on, but I took off the turban. I couldn't face Putney High Street in a turban. I put it in my box. And then suddenly these guys started laughing at me, saying, "Jesus, Jesus." And I couldn't figure out why they were saying this. It took me about 2 minutes, by which time I missed my chance to offer any kind of rejoinder. I realized that they thought I was a priest, and they were mocking me because they thought I was a priest in a kind of traditional Catholic sultan or something. And that brought home to me, I think, something that Muslims don't always realize, which is that there's a larger picture, which is a general prejudice against religion in general. Anyway, I want to talk about these genealogies, and particularly the word Islamophobia. It goes back to its first usage in 1904 by Shaykh Abdal al-Aqili. There's been quite a lot of interest in him recently, a Swedish Muslim who studied at Al-Azhar, who converted quite a lot of people who then become significant for the development of European Muslim thought. And we had his 150th birthday recently, so there were conferences, new translations. And it turns out that even though he's writing mostly before the First World War, he really quite presciently anticipates many of the things that we're still quarreling about today, especially the definition of Islamophobia. So I thought I'd actually let him speak and quote a little bit from what he says. This is 1904. On Islamophobia. In Europe, there are people who hate both Islam and Muslims at the same time. There are others who do not want Islam, yet sympathize with Orientals. And there are people who love both Islam and Orientals. So he immediately kind of differentiates, not everybody is Islamophobic. And then, and it's particularly relevant for our current debates as to whether Islamophobia is somehow connected to racism or can be described as a form of racism. He says, for instance, the first category includes mainly Catholic clerics who by dogma must consider Muslims as well as all non-Catholic Christians damned in this world and in the next. There are many ignorant people who believe this damnation is evident due to outward signs, such as the small fact that educated Parisians of the bourgeois class believe that when a Muslim washes himself, the water fills with worms. So that's the French Islamophobia before the First World War. But he goes on. There are two more types of Islamophobia, the German type and the Russian type. And here is where the relevance of the comparison with racism becomes unmistakable. The German type is confused with the theory of inferior races. It has its origin in a philosophical school commonly called the philosophy of the barracks, which aims to prove logically and philosophically that the Aryans alone are those who have human rights, and not all of them, but only the Germans, who are Aryans par excellence. For this, one is German or is a Negro. It is extremely dangerous for such a theory, since this school systematically, logically, philosophically establishes that Germany has not only the right, but the sacrosanct duty to subject all the other people of the earth, to forbid them to think, to live, to speak otherwise than in German. So that's Islamophobia as a form of racism. And then Russian Islamophobia is a Byzantine Islamophobia, simply consists in telling the Turks, do not believe in the Quran. It is a book that spoils your soul and body. Be Russian, that is, be like us, then you will have everything you want. Now, everyone knows that Russians want no more than three things: icons, vodka, and the whip. Well, a bit of Russophobia there, perhaps. But my point is that at the beginning of our European Muslim discussions, and Aqili is the one who converts people like René Guénon and others who really have a big impact on our communities, that Islamophobia is already regarded as being a complex thing, some manifestations of which are clearly epiphenomena of a more deeper scientific racism. So that's one genealogy. Another, of course, is the indigenous Islamic one, which is the seerah, and how early Islam sees itself, and how the Quran repeats, sometimes quite frankly, the Islamophobic utterances of the pagans and other detractors. And one of the salient facts of the seerah is that it's a revolutionary overturning of Arab tribalism and racism, and brings in Bilal the Abyssinian, Sahib the Greek, Salman the poet as equals in this community that is not a race. Everything before then has been race and tribe in Arabia. Islam is transracial, trans-tribal, deliberately constructs itself as not being a people. So another genealogy, that of British Islam, this goes back to, as far as I can tell, Sir Robert of St Albans, who is kind of one of those famous British Muslim romantic heroes, who dies in 1187, who is the Crusader Templar knight who converts to Islam, marries Saladin's niece, and helps the Muslims. He leads one of the squadrons at the Battle of Hittin that defeats the Crusaders, so he has a significant role in history. The Crusader chronicles, of course, are Islamophobic against him, but race doesn't come into it. It's all about turning Saracen means accepting the doctrines of the Saracens. They're not interested in race. Generally, the medievals and their Islamophobia is much less racist than what we find in more recent times. Thomas Keith is another of my favorites. He becomes a Muslim, joins the Ottoman army, is the governor of Medina, appointed there because of his famous piety, and dies in 1815. And there are kind of books about him. There's Rosemary Sutcliffe, who writes historical novels. Blood and Sand is a rather kind of lurid account of Ibrahim Agha, full of Islamophobic stereotypes, but she doesn't pretend that this is a sort of racism. He's Scottish, he's not joined another race. Also in the Inquisition archives, we find when the Inquisition grabs British Muslims in particular, the Inquisition priests are really not interested in race. Islamophobia is not a form of racism. For them, it's just about creed and believing in a false prophet. So those are three different genealogies. Looking at more recent times, we find that even though this Aqili's identification of a possible racist basis for Islamophobia still exists in certain circles, particularly in areas where Muslims are fairly ethnically homogeneous and where the outward color of the skin is seen to mirror the Sibratullah, Allah's dying of the heart, DYE, of course, that Europe is increasingly so ethnically diverse that in many cases doesn't work. The Bosnian War, for instance, was really Islamophobic, but the people were ethnically the same. They spoke the same language, they looked the same. It was about religion and cultural aspects of religion. In the UK, 9% of Muslims, according to the 2011 census, are white. When they experience Islamophobia, they're not victims of racism. So, for instance, recently I went into a meeting at the University of Cambridge, and the professor of English, who knows I'm a Muslim, said, "Have you got a bomb in that bag?" He thought this was a kind of amusing way of starting the session. Well, that's not racism. That's just specifically about Islam, Muslims, terrorism, that narrative, but it's not racism. In Switzerland, more than half the Muslims are white, but they have the minaret ban. It's pretty Islamophobic. At the time that they brought in that ban, I actually sent an email as an academic to the Swiss Ministry of Justice with some cheeky questions. So I said, what happens if a Christian builds a minaret? A nice tall minaret with a golden crescent on top. Is that legally, under Swiss law, a minaret? And the Ministry of Justice went quiet for a bit, and then they sent me a message saying, no, it's built by a non-Muslim, it's not a minaret, and it doesn't need to be demolished. So I had a bit more fun. And then I said, what happens if a Muslim group buys a church with a steeple? Does the steeple then become a minaret under Swiss law? Silence from the bureaucracy in Bern. And then the message came back, yes, it hasn't been tested in the courts, but we think that the moment that building is owned by a Muslim group, the steeple becomes a minaret and is therefore illegal and should be removed. So it's a reminder that these anti-Muslim laws that are popping up in Europe now are absurd, very difficult really to pin down. But in Switzerland, it's really not racism. It's about the Islam of a population, the majority of which is actually white. So it's not a race. Sometimes we hear talk of cultural racism, which is a kind of technical piece of jargon that some social scientists might make sense of. But I think it's so technical and counterintuitive that most people in the real world are not really going to relate to it. And we have people like Ayad Hirsi Ali, many other ex-Muslims, anti-Muslims, Islamophobes of Islamic origin. The ghostwriter of Milo Yiannopoulos' best-selling Islamophobic book was a British Muslim Asian origin, doesn't like Islam too much. So are those people who are black and brown and against Islam also racist? It's not immediately intuitive or obvious that you can call that kind of very widespread Islamophobia racist. In Sweden, some of the loudest anti-Muslim talk comes from Swedish parliamentarians of Iranian origin. Are they being racist? Not immediately obvious. That's a helpful way of framing it. So generally, I'm against this idea of Islam as intersectional with racism, because it really doesn't cover the complex diversity of society, and may even be racist itself against people who happen to be of white extraction from Kosovo or wherever, who feel that they're not protected by this definition, because evidently prejudice against them can't really be determined to be a form of racism. So to call Islamophobia a form of racism may actually be itself racist. That needs to be discussed. So finally, what are the solutions? Well, I think that communities are increasingly diverse. There's more and more intermarriage, but we need proper Muslim PR. I think the leadership has not really explained to the population what Islam is. We just trusted to the journalists to do it rather than taking the initiative, and it's not working out too well. We need better leadership training for our communities. Probably the cultural style needs to change. Mosques that are built in a very flagrant and conspicuously non-European or non-British style may give a kind of reassuring sense of home to older worshippers, but are not likely to be seen as respectful to local culture by many passers-by. The biggest ever police operation in South Cambridgeshire, over 1,000 officers, happened when the EDL marched against the new Cambridge Mosque, about 400 of them. And it was a difficult standoff. But because the mosque was designed according to a style that looked kind of modern but had British dimensions, the locals ended up loving it, and there's not been a single Islamic attack or incident apart from sort of random messages of a very low-grade type. So I think mosque design is actually very important, because that flags up how the community wants to be seen. Does it want to be seen as respectful to the British narrative, however loosely that might have to be defined, or is it going to be rather aggressively a badge of belonging to a beautiful but distant homeland? Again, something that communities really need to think carefully about. So I want to end by getting back to Aqili, because as Julie said, there's a lot of kind of victim mentality in Muslim communities. And this evening, we haven't really heard enough about religion. We've heard a lot of sociological analysis, cause and effect. It's been quite secular. So I want to close with something that Shaykh Abdul Hadi wrote in August 1902, when he's discussing, what he says, why Europeans have come to understand Islam so little and so badly. So he says this: the current state of affairs between East and West may at first glance appear as grave and unsettling. Yet anyone who believes that the power of Allah encompasses both good and evil should neither be surprised nor disheartened. All is providential, and wherever man blasphemes, desecrates, and insults, there the beneficent, the merciful, also spreads his blessings. Across the deaths and the ruins, fates are fulfilled according to the obscure law of the eternal equilibrium and the ways of mystery. Thus, far beyond the storms and cataclysms, the vows of the believers constitute a cosmic force. Presume for an instant that all copies of the sublime scripture were destroyed, and every believer was slain to the very last man. Islam would still live on, for its abode is not of this world. God has no need for us, but we have a need for him. We strive on with the religious obligations imposed upon us and fulfill them with humble joy. Nevertheless, we prefer that our prayers reach the throne of the Most High rather than to have success in this world. The religion of sacred formulae, the alchemy of hope and repentance, the theology of God's greatness and the misery of man, the profound devotion, the simplicity and sincerity, the initiation to spiritual delight and drunkenness from the inner sensation of the celestial, all this cannot simply disappear. So it's a simple, slightly sermonizing ending, I guess, that we have to have tawakkul and remember that God is ultimately in charge. Inna Allaha ala kulli shay'in qadir.